Welcome to Last Minute Lecture. This free chapter overview is designed to help students review and understand key concepts. These summaries supplement, not replace, the original textbook and may not be redistributed or resold. For complete coverage, always consult the official text. In the ICU, if you don't feed a patient's gut for just 3 days, the microscopic structures protecting their bloodstream completely vanish.
Yeah, it's actually terrifying.
Right. You aren't just dealing with a hungry patient. You are looking at the total collapse of their systemic immunity.
And, that biological collapse happens infinitely faster than most clinicians realize. Welcome to the deep dive.
Today, we are focusing entirely on Chapter 6 of Introduction to Critical Care Nursing, the 7th edition. The focus is nutritional therapy.
We are essentially acting as your one-on-one tutors for this material today.
Exactly. You're gearing up for your critical care clinicals, so we are bypassing the basic biology and zooming straight into the clinical judgments.
Right, the pathophysiology, the calculations, and the life-saving nursing actions you actually need at the bedside.
Because the stakes here are incredibly high. The text notes that malnutrition occurs in 20% to 50% of hospitalized patients.
Which is a massive chunk of the population.
It really is. And when you add the severe metabolic demands of trauma or burns or sepsis, a patient's protein and energy metabolism it's completely upended.
Which is why the chapter opens with that classic Hippocrates quote, let food be thy medicine.
Yeah, but in critical care, food isn't just medicine. It is a physiological necessity to keep organs from literally breaking down.
Absolutely. Let's look at the gut's mucosal defense system to understand why. So the GI tract relies on epithelial cells that are linked by these tight junctions.
Right, those junctions are basically the gatekeepers.
Exactly. And right behind those gatekeepers is the gut-associated lymphoid tissue, or GALT.
Okay, so the GALT is your immune front line against the bacteria naturally living in the gut.
Right. Now, the functional structures actually absorbing nutrients are the villi. But here is the critical mechanism. Villi don't just sit there.
They need maintenance.
Right. They replenish every 3 to 4 days, but they only do this if they receive direct stimulation from enteral nutrients in the gut cavity.
Okay, let's unpack this. The gut is basically a muscle that atrophies if you don't use it.
I love that analogy.
If we don't feed the gut, those villi disappear in just 3 days, and the border wall protecting the bloodstream from toxic invaders just crumbles.
What's fascinating here is how this connects to critical illness. When your patient is dealing with shock, the sympathetic nervous system activates.
The fight or flight response.
Exactly, and it shunts blood away from the splanchnic circulation, the gut, to perfuse the brain and heart.
Oh, wow. So the gut is just left to starve.
Right. This creates profound ischemia in the intestinal tissue. Without oxygen and normal blood flow, those tight junctions rapidly degrade.
And if you add a lack of enteral nutrition on top of that baseline hypoperfusion, the mucosal barrier doesn't stand a chance.
That bacterial translocation is a direct highway to sepsis.
To prevent that collapse, we really need to trace how a healthy system processes nutrients, specifically focusing on what matters to an ICU nurse.
Let's start in the stomach.
So it drops the pH to roughly 2.0 to break down molecules, but it also secretes intrinsic factor.
And without intrinsic factor, the body cannot absorb vitamin B12 later on in the ileum.
Which is a huge deal.
It is. Why do we care? Because B12 is mandatory for red blood cell formation.
So if your patient has severe gastric dysfunction and loses that intrinsic factor, their body eventually stops producing sufficient red blood cells.
Exactly. You're not just looking at a digestion issue, you're looking at a profound hematologic deficit that completely compromises their oxygen carrying capacity.
Wow. Okay, so as that highly acidic chyme moves from the stomach into the duodenum, we hit another protective mechanism, right?
Right, the mucus-secreting Brunner glands. They produce an alkaline compound to raise the pH back up to about 7.0.
But if a critically ill patient is under immense physiologic stress, their cortisol spikes.
And that's where the problem starts. That mucus production plummets, and that harsh stomach acid starts eating right through the duodenal wall.
Which is exactly how stress ulcers develop.
Spot on. Then the chyme moves through the jejunum and ileum, where the heavy lifting of absorption happens. Sugars, amino acids, fats, and vitamins.
And the colon finishes the job by absorbing sodium and potassium and synthesizing vitamin K via bacterial action.
Which, as we know, is vital for the clotting cascade. But we really can't talk about normal physiology without talking about the liver.
Right, the massive metabolic factory. The liver synthesizes circulating proteins like albumin and clotting factors.
But crucially for our ICU patients, it handles the toxic byproducts of protein breakdown.
Like ammonia. When amino acids are metabolized, they produce ammonia.
Exactly. The liver detoxifies that ammonia by combining it with carbon dioxide to form urea, which the kidneys then excrete.
But if the liver fails, that ammonia builds up in the blood.
Right, it crosses the blood-brain barrier and causes profound hepatic encephalopathy.
The liver also manages your patient's blood glucose. Right?
Oh.
Like when glycogen reserves are depleted, the liver carries out gluconeogenesis.
Actively creating new glucose from substrates like amino acids to keep the brain fueled.
But here's the kicker. If they are using amino acids for gluconeogenesis, where are those amino acids coming from?
They're coming straight from the breakdown of skeletal muscle.
This is why ICU patients experience massive muscle wasting.
Yeah, it's brutal. If they are catabolizing their diaphragm for energy, they simply won't have the mechanical strength to breathe on their own.
Weaning them off a mechanical ventilator incredibly difficult. Nutrition directly impacts respiratory failure.
It's all connected. Because that gut barrier and metabolic machinery can collapse so quickly, we're racing against a 24-hour clock the moment a patient is admitted.
Right. The text mandates that nutritional screening occur within the first 24 hours of hospital admission using validated tools.
Like the NRS 2002 or the NUTRIC score.
We gather objective data right away. Does the patient have an adequate gag reflex? Can they swallow?
If there is any doubt at all, you consult speech pathology. And the golden rule here, you never feed an overly sedated or intubated patient orally.
But wait, let me play devil's advocate for a second. If a patient is crashing, say they are intubated and on 3 different vasopressors, is conducting a nutritional screening really the priority?
It's a fair question.
Like, shouldn't we be entirely focused on keeping their blood pressure up?
It feels counterintuitive, I know. But assessing them within that window tells us if they are already in a hypermetabolic or catabolic state.
Okay, I see.
That baseline dictates every single fluid volume and medication dosage we calculate next.
Because if they are catabolic, their body is actively breaking down its own muscle and organ tissue for an energy.
Exactly. If we don't identify that and intervene, their body simply won't have the biological resources to heal their primary injury.
Makes total sense. We also have to apply this to the lifespan considerations box for older adults.
Patients over 65 enter the ICU with uniquely high nutritional risks.
We had talking about structural issues like poorly fitting dentures or, social isolation where they simply experience more hunger because they can't access food or cook for themselves.
They also face polypharmacy. Taking multiple daily medications drastically alters taste and odor perceptions.
Right, so foods they used to enjoy might taste metallic or completely bland.
Severely suppressing their appetite long before they even got sick.
So identifying the deficit is really only half the battle. The immediate clinical dilemma becomes the route of delivery.
That urgency forces a decision. Do we use the gut or bypass it entirely?
This is the choice between enteral nutrition, or EN, and parenteral nutrition, or PN.
EN is feeding via the GI tract, and it is always the preferred route if the patient has a functioning gut.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Think of enteral nutrition as taking the scenic route to keep the local roads maintained. Parenteral is the intravenous superhighway when the local roads are completely washed out.
What's fascinating here is why EN is superior. By utilizing the gut, EN prevents that bacterial overgrowth and stops migration across the intestinal wall.
It actively saves the critically ill patient from sepsis.
Exactly. So how are we delivering those supplies? You can use large bore tubes, like a standard NG tube, which can also decompress the stomach.
But if a patient can't tolerate that, you switch to a flexible small bore tube advanced past the stomach into the duodenum or jejunum.
Placement verification is critical here. Historically, you always had to wait for an X-ray before using the tube.
Right, but the text highlights new Cortac electromagnetic sensor-guided systems.
This technology is brilliant. It uses a magnetic sensor at the tip of the tube that provides a real-time visual tracing on a monitor during insertion.
You can literally watch the tube curve on the screen.
Yeah, it almost completely eliminates the risk of accidentally threading the tube into the lung.
And it makes post-caloric placement, getting past the stomach sphincter much easier, often without needing an X-ray at all.
And getting past the stomach matters immensely. The evidence-based practice box compares post-pyloric feeding to gastric feeding.
Post-pyloric feeding significantly reduces the rate of pneumonia.
Because you bypass the stomach entirely, meaning the liquid formula is much less likely to reflux up the esophagus and be aspirated into the lungs.
But what if those local roads are completely impassable? Say the patient has a prolonged paralytic ileus, a mechanical bowel obstruction, or intractable vomiting.
That is when you switch to parenteral nutrition, bypassing the gut entirely.
But PN comes with a major safety caveat, specifically with total parenteral nutrition, or TPN.
Right, because TPN has an incredibly high glucose concentration and osmolarity.
If you run that through a standard peripheral IV, it will destroy the vein and cause severe phlebitis.
TPN requires a central venous catheter. That means a PICC line, a Hickman, or an implanted port where the tip ends in the massive superior vena cava,
where the high blood volume instantly dilutes the solution. And to be absolutely clear, midline catheters are not central lines and can never be used for TPN.
Never. Regardless of the route, we also evaluate immune-enhancing additives, outlined in Table 6.1.
These are formulas enriched with arginine, glutamine, and omega-3 fatty acids.
They are specifically recommended for patients with greater than 30% body surface area burns, severe trauma injuries, or those needing mechanical ventilation without severe sepsis.
They modulate the inflammatory response and have been shown to decrease length of stay and infection risk.
Okay, so we have the route. Now we have to calculate the payload.
Table 6.2 lays out the estimation of nutrient needs. The baseline equation is 25 to 30 kilocalories per kilogram per day.
But that scales up dynamically based on physiological stress.
A moderately stressed patient, maybe someone acutely ill or post-op, needs 30 to 35 kilocalories per kilogram and 1.0 to 1.5 grams of protein per kilogram.
But a severely stressed patient, someone facing a major trauma and a septic event, needs 35 kilocalories and up to 2.0 grams of protein just to fight that massive catabolic breakdown?
The guidelines for obese patients, those with a BMI over 30, are particularly interesting.
Right, you don't just calculate their total weight or you'd massively overfeed them.
Exactly. The guidelines recommend high protein but hypocaloric feedings.
You are giving them enough protein to preserve their lean muscle mass and promote wound healing, but restricting the total calories to avoid hyperglycemia and fat deposition.
Speaking of fats, we need to discuss lipids given concurrently with parenteral nutrition.
The current guidelines state we should hold soy-based lipids for the first week of critical illness.
Because soy-based lipids are rich in omega-6 fatty acids, which are inherently pro-inflammatory.
When a patient is already in a state of systemic inflammation, adding a pro-inflammatory lipid emulsion just exacerbates their immune chaos.
So holding it for the first week significantly decreases infection rates.
Now, when you look at enteral formulas in Table 6.3, the default is a standard polymeric isotonic formula around 1.0 to 1.5 kilocalories per milliliter for normal GI function.
If the gut is dysfunctional, you switch to an elemental formula where the proteins are pre-digested into free amino acids, so the gut doesn't have to work as hard.
And for patients with strict fluid restrictions, like severe heart failure, you use a calorie-dense formula packing 2 kilocalories per milliliter,
giving them the energy without the fluid overload.
So what does this all mean for your daily checklist as a nurse? Are you calculating these calories yourself?
Not exactly. As a nurse, you are part of an interdisciplinary team. A registered dietitian and a pharmacist will actually calculate and formulate the specific prescriptions.
But the Society of Critical Care Medicine guidelines place the execution of this therapy squarely on your shoulders at the bedside.
You are the one advocating to start enteral feeds within 24 to 48 hours of admission.
And here is a practice-changing update from those guidelines. Do not wait for bowel sounds to start enteral nutrition.
Yeah, that is a completely outdated metric. Just because you don't hear a gurgle with your stethoscope doesn't mean the small intestine isn't ready to absorb nutrients.
So you're saying just go ahead and start it?
Yes. The text also targets another outdated practice, gastric residual volumes, or GRVs.
Historically, nurses would pull back on the feeding tube with a syringe every 4 hours to see how much formula was sitting in the stomach. Right, checking for delayed gastric emptying. But recent guidelines strongly advise against regular assessment of GRV.
Because it leads to clogged tubes and inappropriate feeding interruptions, creating massive caloric deficits for the patient without actually reducing the risk of aspiration.
Exactly. If your specific facility protocol still demands GRV checks, the guidelines are clear. Do not hold the feeding unless the pulled volume is over 500 milliliters.
Okay, so once that pump is finally running, the vigilant monitoring phase begins. To prevent mechanical obstruction, you are flushing those feeding tubes with 30 milliliters of water every 4 hours during continuous feeding.
And always before and after administering medications. And a huge safety rule. Never crush sustained-release or enteric-coated medications to push down a tube.
Because crushing a sustained-release pill destroys the delivery mechanism, causing an immediate, potentially lethal overdose.
We also aggressively monitor drug-nutrient interactions. Take the seizure medication phenytoin.
Its bioavailability is severely reduced by enteral formulas because the protein in the feed physically binds to the drug.
Which means if you run them together, the patient isn't getting their anti-seizure meds.
So current protocols dictate stopping the continuous feeding 1 to 2 hours before and after dosing phenytoin and meticulously monitoring serum drug levels.
But think about the math here. If you are stopping the continuous feed for an hour before and an hour after the dose, and they get phenytoin twice a day,
you are losing 4 hours of feeding time. That creates a massive caloric deficit.
Exactly. This means the nurse must collaborate with the dietitian to recalculate the hourly pump rate during the remaining 20 hours to ensure the patient still receives their full, total daily volume.
You don't just pause the pump, you manage the deficit.
Of all the complications we monitor, the most terrifying metabolic crisis is refeeding syndrome.
I've always thought of refeeding syndrome like trying to jumpstart a car that's been sitting in a freezing garage for years by instantly flooring the gas pedal.
You're going to completely blow the engine.
Exactly.
To push that car analogy further, the spark plugs in this scenario are your intracellular electrolytes. When a patient is severely malnourished, say a severe alcoholic or someone who hasn't eaten in weeks,
their total body stores of electrolytes are completely depleted, even if their blood levels look somewhat normal.
Right. So what happens when you rapidly introduce enteral or parenteral feeding?
The sudden influx of glucose triggers a massive spike in insulin.
That insulin surge acts like a vacuum, forcing glucose into the cells. The cell immediately starts glycolysis to create ATP.
And that process requires massive amounts of phosphorus, so the cell pulls all available phosphorus out of the blood.
It also drives potassium and magnesium inside. You consume whatever spark plugs were left in the serum.
The bloodstream is instantly depleted, and the clinical result is catastrophic.
Without those electrolytes, the patient rapidly develops respiratory muscle failure from the low phosphorus,
Lethal cardiac dysrhythmias from the low potassium.
rhabdomyolysis, and total cardiovascular collapse.
This raises an important point about how we view our role at the bedside. You must relentlessly monitor glucose and those specific electrolytes, sodium, potassium, magnesium, phosphorus, at least every 6 hours initially.
You are the line of defense recognizing those subtle lab shifts before the cardiovascular collapse occurs.
We also monitor specific labs to evaluate if the nutritional therapy is actually working. The text points out a crucial distinction between albumin and prealbumin.
You might see a low albumin and think acute malnutrition.
But albumin has a half-life of 20 to 22 days. It's a terrible indicator of acute day-to-day changes.
Prealbumin, however, has a half-life of just 2 days. It is a highly sensitive indicator of acute nutritional change.
Let's apply all of these mechanisms to the textbook's case study. We have Mr. H.
Post-op day 7 after a coronary artery bypass graft.
He hasn't consumed significant calories since the operation, has poor dentition, and a history of a 20-pound weight loss in the last month.
We pull his labs. His prealbumin is critically low at less than 7.4. Normal is 16.4 to 38.
Based on Table 6.2, combining his severe surgical stress, his massive recent weight loss, and that plummeting prealbumin, Mr. H is in a highly stressed catabolic state.
His body is literally consuming its own healing tissues.
So his target goal is not the standard 25 kilocalories. He needs the severely stressed calculation of 35 kilocalories per kilogram per day.
And a massive protein boost of 1.5 to 2.0 grams per kilogram to stop that catabolism.
And because his GI tract is functional, but he has poor dentition, the preferred route is enteral nutrition to protect the remaining integrity of his gut mucosal barrier.
Every concept we've covered today, from understanding the epithelial tight junctions, to recognizing the insulin spike in refeeding syndrome,
to refusing to stop a pump for absent bowel sounds.
they are all targeted clinical actions designed to keep your patient alive.
It is a massive amount of physiology to process. But as you walk onto the unit for your clinicals, I want to leave you with a total paradigm shift.
What's that?
Next time you look at a bag of tube feeding hanging on an IV pole, or a PPN line threaded into a central vein, don't just see lunch.
See a highly titrated, life-saving medication.
A medication actively keeping the intestinal walls from breaking down, fueling the immune system, and fighting off sepsis. Thank you from the Last Minute Lecture team.
Good luck on your clinicals. You are going to do great.
Trust your knowledge, advocate for your patients, and we'll see you next time.